It was Christmas Eve in Boston, and the streets were cloaked in a bitter winter chill. Snow fell steadily, blanketing the city in silence, save for the occasional car that rolled by, its headlights cutting through the dark. In the heart of the city, on a forgotten stretch of Beacon Hill, a man named George sat huddled beneath a fraying woolen blanket. His hands, red and raw from the cold, gripped a tattered cardboard sign that read, "Lost everything. Anything helps." God bless, George wasn't always homeless. There was a time, not too long ago, when he had a home, a family, and a stable job working as a carpenter. But life has a way of unraveling, thread by thread, and for George, it began with the unexpected death of his wife, Marlene. The grief consumed him, and soon after, he lost his job, his house, and eventually, his will to fight back. By Christmas Eve, George had been living on the streets for 2 years, a ghost of the man he once was. The holiday season, once a time of joy, now felt like a cruel reminder of everything he had lost. The streets of Boston that night were filled with merriment, families rushing home with last-minute gifts, the jingling of Salvation Army bells, the glow of lights from Christmas trees inside warm homes. But none of it reached George. He sat in the icy shadows, invisible to the world, save for one tiny creature who watched him from a distance. The stray cat appeared out of nowhere, a small, scrappy tabby with patches of orange and white fur. She had been wandering the alleys and streets for months, living off scraps and the occasional kindness of strangers. Her ears were torn from past fights, and her left paw carried a slight limp, but her eyes sparkled with intelligence and curiosity. Tonight, she had no particular destination in mind, but something about the hunched figure of George drew her in. At first, the cat observed him from afar, her sleek body pressed against a snow-covered trash can. She watched as George sighed heavily and pulled his blanket tighter, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. There was an unspoken loneliness between them, a shared sense of being forgotten by the world. Tentatively, the cat took a few steps closer, her paws crunching softly against the snow. George didn't notice her right away. He was too lost in his thoughts, staring blankly at the blinking Christmas lights on a nearby lamppost. When the cat finally reached him, she let out a soft, raspy meow. Startled, George looked down and met her wide, golden eyes. For a moment, he simply stared at her, unsure of what to do. Then, almost instinctively, he reached out a trembling hand. The cat didn't flinch. Instead, she leaned into his touch, her fur warm against his frozen fingers. It was the first warmth George had felt in weeks, and it brought a lump to his throat. "Well, aren't you something?" he murmured, his voice cracked and hoarse. The cat purred in response, her body vibrating against his palm. George chuckled softly, a sound he hadn't made in months, and for a fleeting moment, he felt a spark of something he thought he had lost forever: hope. As the night wore on, the cat stayed by George's side. She curled up in his lap, sharing her meager warmth with him, and occasionally looked up at him with an expression that seemed almost human in its understanding. George decided to call her Mittens, partly because of the white patches on her paws, but mostly because her presence felt like a soft, comforting embrace against the harshness of the world. Unbeknownst to them, their unlikely bond was about to set off a chain of events that would change both their lives forever. As midnight approached, the streets grew quieter, and the snow fell heavier. George, feeling a rare sense of peace with Mittens nestled against him, didn't notice the group of rowdy teenagers approaching until it was too late. They were young and reckless, fueled by alcohol and the cruel boredom of youth. One of them kicked over George's small pile of belongings, scattering what little he had into the snow. Another grabbed his cardboard sign and tore it in half, laughing as he did so. "Hey!" George protested weakly, but his voice was drowned out by their mocking laughter. Mittens hissed and arched her back, her small body standing between George and the boys. One of them laughed even harder. "What's this? Your little guard cat?" The leader of the group bent down, scooping up a handful of snow. He packed it into a ball and hurled it at George, hitting him square in the chest. George winced but didn't fight back. He had long since learned that resistance only made things worse. But Mittens was different. The moment the snowball hit George, she lunged at the boy, claws outstretched. She didn't hesitate, didn't think twice about the difference in their sizes. Her sharp claws raked across his hand, and he yelped in pain, dropping the next snowball he had been preparing. "Stupid cat," he shouted, but the sight of Mittens, now hissing and growling with a ferocity far beyond her small size, made him and his friends reconsider. One by one, they backed away, muttering insults under their breath. Finally, they disappeared into the night, leaving George and Mittens alone once more. Shaken but unharmed, George looked down at Mittens, who was now sitting calmly at his feet, licking her paw as if nothing had happened. A surge of gratitude and awe swelled in his chest. "You're a brave little thing, aren't you?" he said, his voice trembling. Mittens looked up at him, her golden eyes full of quiet determination. For the first time in years, George felt something other than despair. He felt protected. And for the first time in her life, Mittens felt something she had never known: a purpose. The morning after Christmas Eve brought no reprieve from the biting cold. The snowstorm that had started the previous night had settled into a steady flurry, leaving Beacon Hill draped in a glistening white coat. George woke slowly, his joints stiff and aching from the chill. For a moment, he forgot where he was, until his eyes settled on Mittens, curled tightly against his chest. Her rhythmic purring was the only sound in the still morning, a gentle reminder that, for now, he wasn't entirely alone. "Morning, Mittens," George murmured, his voice still raspy from the cold. He scratched her behind the ears, and she stretched languidly, letting out a soft meow. It was strange, George thought, how quickly he had grown attached to her. In the span of just a few hours, this scrappy stray had become his companion, his protector, and, in a way he couldn't quite explain, his lifeline. But reality soon intruded. George's stomach growled loudly, a sharp reminder of the fact that he hadn't eaten in 2 days. His fingers fumbled through his meager belongings. A few coins, a threadbare scarf, and an empty thermos. But there was nothing of value, nothing to trade for even the smallest morsel of food. He sighed heavily, glancing down at Mittens. "I guess we're both out of luck," he said with a wry smile. Mittens tilted her head, as if she understood, and nuzzled against his hand. By midday, George had relocated to a busier part of the city, hoping that the post-Christmas crowds might be more generous. He sat on a cold patch of concrete outside a bustling coffee shop, Mittens perched beside him like a loyal sentinel. Her presence drew attention. Passers-by slowed to glance at the unusual sight of a stray cat sitting so calmly next to a homeless man. A few even dropped spare change into George's cup, their curiosity piqued by Mittens' piercing golden eyes and the way she seemed to watch everyone with a quiet intensity. "Is she yours?" a woman asked as she crouched down to pet Mittens. She was young, probably in her late 20s, with a kind face and a scarf wrapped tightly around her neck. "In a way," George replied. "She found me last night." The woman smiled, pulling a small sandwich bag from her purse. "Here, for both of you," she said, handing it to George. Inside was half a turkey sandwich, neatly wrapped, and a small pouch of cat treats. George's throat tightened with emotion as he took the bag. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman nodded, giving Mittens one last scratch behind the ears before disappearing into the crowd. The sandwich was the best thing George had tasted in weeks, and he shared it with Mittens, who devoured her portion with gusto. For a brief moment, it felt like the world wasn't entirely cruel. But the reprieve didn't last long. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the city, George's luck took a darker turn. Around dusk, a familiar figure emerged from the alley across the street. A burly man in a tattered coat, his face half hidden by a scruffy beard. George stiffened immediately. It was Frank, a fellow homeless man who had a reputation for being aggressive and territorial. Frank had always viewed the streets as his domain, and anyone encroaching on his turf often paid the price. Well, look who it is," Frank growled as he crossed the street, his eyes narrowing at George. "Didn't I tell you to stay out of this part of town?" "I'm just passing through," George said carefully, his hands instinctively moving to shield Mittens. Frank snorted, his gaze shifting to the cat. "What's this? You got yourself a little mascot now? Maybe I should take her off your hands." "She's not yours," George said firmly, surprising himself with the strength in his voice. Frank's expression darkened. "Nothing out here belongs to anyone," he said, stepping closer. "That cat's just another mouth to feed. You can't even take care of yourself." Mittens, sensing the tension, hissed loudly and puffed up her fur, positioning herself between George and Frank. Her small body was a study in defiance, her golden eyes glaring up at the towering man as if daring him to make a move. Frank laughed, a low, menacing sound. "Feisty little thing, huh? Maybe I'll teach her a lesson." He reached down, his hand grabbing for Mittens, but before he could touch her, George surged to his feet. "Don't," George said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "She's all I have." For a moment, Frank hesitated, his hand hovering in midair. Then, with a sneer, he stepped back. "You're pathetic," he spat. "Both of you." He turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. George sank back down onto the concrete, his hands shaking. Mittens climbed into his lap, purring softly as if to reassure him. "You really are something else," George said, his voice thick with emotion. "You don't back down, do you?" That night, George made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this, not for himself and certainly not for Mittens. She deserved better than the streets, and if he was honest with himself, so did he. But the question was, how? He had no money, no family, and no prospects. The world had been unforgiving for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to hope for something better. As he lay beneath his blanket, Mittens curled tightly against his chest. George whispered a silent prayer into the cold night air. "Help me," he said, his voice breaking. "I don't know how, but help me." Little did George know, his plea had not gone unheard. The bond between him and Mittens was about to set into motion a series of events that would test their strength, their faith, and their willingness to fight for a second chance. The morning after George whispered his prayer into the icy night, something remarkable happened. He woke to find Mittens gently pawing at his chest, her golden eyes staring intently into his. She let out a small, insistent meow and turned toward the street, her tail flicking. Confused, George sat up, pulling his blanket tighter around him. Mittens darted forward, her limp barely visible as she padded toward a group of people gathering at the far end of the park. "What is it, girl?" George muttered, rising slowly to his feet. His body protested, sore from weeks of sleeping on frozen pavement, but Mittens' urgency compelled him to follow. He shuffled after her, clutching his blanket like a lifeline. As he approached the crowd, George realized it wasn't just an ordinary gathering. A mobile van, brightly painted with the words, "The Beacon of Hope Foundation," was parked near a bench, and volunteers wearing red scarves were handing out cups of hot coffee and brown paper bags filled with food. A sign hung on the side of the van read, "Holiday Outreach. Help for those in need." Mittens trotted right up to the van, her small body weaving through the legs of the crowd. George hesitated at the edge of the group, his heart pounding. He had learned to keep his distance from events like this. Too often, they came with judgmental stares or pitying looks that left him feeling even more invisible than the cold streets did. But Mittens was insistent. She sat down in front of the van, looking back at George and letting out a loud, commanding meow, as if to say, "Come on, you can do this." One of the volunteers, a woman with kind eyes and silver-streaked hair, noticed Mittens first. She crouched down, holding out her hand. "Well, aren't you a beauty?" she cooed. Mittens, ever bold, walked right up to her and rubbed against her leg. The woman laughed softly, then glanced up and saw George standing awkwardly a few feet away. "Is she yours?" the woman asked. George hesitated, unsure how to answer. "She found me," he said finally. The woman smiled. "Smart cat. She led you right to us." She straightened up and gestured toward the van. "We've got hot coffee and some food, if you're hungry." George's stomach clenched at the mention of food, but his pride held him back. "I don't want to take anything from someone else," he said, his voice barely audible. "Nonsense," the woman replied firmly. "There's plenty for everyone." She stepped closer, her expression softening. "You look like you've had a rough time. Let us help." Mittens meowed again, as if echoing the woman's words. George glanced down at her, and in that moment, he felt something shift inside him. Maybe it was the warmth in the woman's eyes, or the way Mittens seemed so sure of herself despite everything she had been through. Whatever it was, George nodded and stepped forward. The coffee was scalding hot and tasted like heaven. George sipped it slowly, savoring the warmth that spread through his body. A volunteer handed him a paper bag filled with a sandwich, an apple, and a granola bar. As George ate, Mittens sat at his feet, her tail wrapped neatly around her paws, watching the world with quiet vigilance. As the crowd began to thin, the silver-haired woman returned and crouched down beside George. "My name's Helen," she said. "What's yours?" "George," he replied, his voice still hesitant. "Well, George," Helen said, "it's clear you've got a good friend in that little cat of yours. We're actually running a free clinic for pets today, just a few blocks from here. If you'd like, we could take a look at her paw. I noticed she's limping." George blinked, surprised by the offer. "You do that? For free?" Helen nodded. "Of course. Animals like her are just as vulnerable as the people out here. We're here to help both." George looked down at Mittens, who was now licking her paw. He hadn't realized just how much her limp had worsened over the past day. "Okay," he said finally. "Let's do it." The clinic was set up inside a small community center, its walls decorated with colorful holiday banners. Mittens was examined by a young veterinarian named Dr. Lucas, who gently prodded her injured paw while George watched anxiously. "She's got a small infection," Dr. Lucas said after a few minutes. "Nothing too serious, but it's probably painful for her. I'll clean it up and give her some antibiotics. She'll be good as new in a few days." George exhaled a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with gratitude. Dr. Lucas smiled. "She's a tough little cat, and lucky too. Not every stray finds someone to look out for them." "She's the one looking out for me," George admitted, scratching Mittens gently behind the ears. She purred in response, leaning into his touch. As the clinic visit wrapped up, Helen reappeared with a clipboard in hand. "George, I wanted to let you know about one more thing," she said. "We run a program through the foundation that helps people get back on their feet. It's not much, just a temporary shelter and some job resources. But it's a start." George stared at her, the words not quite sinking in. "You do that? For someone like me?" Helen's expression softened. "Of course, everyone deserves a second chance." For a long moment, George was silent. The thought of leaving the streets, of trying to rebuild his life, was overwhelming. But then he looked at Mittens, who was perched on the exam table, her golden eyes locked on his. She had fought for him, against teenagers, against Frank, against the cold itself. If she could do that, couldn't he fight for her too? "Okay," George said finally, his voice steady. "I'll do it. For her." That night, George and Mittens slept in a warm bed for the first time in years. The shelter was simple, a small cot in a shared room, but it felt like a palace compared to the freezing streets. Mittens curled up beside him, her paw freshly bandaged, and George lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in a long time, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in years. Hope. He didn't know what the future held, but as he drifted off to sleep with Mittens purring in his ear, he knew one thing for certain. They had saved each other, and together they could face whatever came next. The following weeks were unlike anything George had experienced in years. The shelter was more than just a roof over his head. It was a place where he could begin to piece his life back together. Each day brought small victories. A hot meal, clean clothes, a sense of safety he hadn't felt in years. And through it all, Mittens remained by his side, her quiet presence grounding him in a way nothing else could. At first, the adjustment was difficult. George wasn't used to the structure of the shelter. There were rules to follow, schedules to keep, and group meetings where he was encouraged to talk about his past and his plans for the future. It was overwhelming at times, and more than once, George considered walking out and returning to the streets. But every time the thought crossed his mind, he would look at Mittens, her golden eyes filled with unwavering trust, and he would find the strength to stay. Mittens quickly became a favorite among the shelter staff and residents. She had a knack for sensing when someone needed comfort, curling up beside them and purring until their worries seemed to melt away. One night, George found her nestled in the lap of a young woman named Carla, who had been crying quietly in the corner of the common room. Carla had lost her job and her apartment after fleeing an abusive relationship, and she rarely spoke to anyone. But with Mittens there, she opened up, telling George how much she missed the cat she had been forced to leave behind. "She's special," Carla said softly, stroking Mittens' fur. "You're lucky to have her." "I know," George replied, his voice filled with emotion. "She saved me." But as George began to rebuild his life, new challenges emerged. The shelter's program required him to look for work, and though he had once been a skilled carpenter, years on the streets had left him rusty and unsure of himself. He filled out applications and attended interviews, but rejection after rejection began to wear on him. It was hard not to feel defeated, especially when he saw other residents starting to move on, finding jobs and apartments while he remained stuck in place. One particularly cold morning, George sat on the steps of the shelter, his head in his hands. Mittens sat beside him, her tail flicking softly against his leg. "I don't know if I can do this," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "What if I'm just not good enough anymore?" Mittens let out a small chirp, nudging his hand with her head. George couldn't help but smile despite himself. "You always know what to say, don't you?" he said, scratching her behind the ears. She purred loudly, and for a moment, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter. Later that day, Helen stopped by the shelter to check on George. She had taken a special interest in him and Mittens, often bringing small bags of cat treats or toys for his feline companion. "How are you holding up?" she asked, sitting down beside him in the common room. George shrugged. "Some days are better than others," he admitted. "I've been trying, but it feels like no one wants to take a chance on me." Helen nodded thoughtfully. "It's hard, I know, but you've already come so far, George. Don't give up now." She reached into her bag and pulled out a flyer. "There's a small woodworking shop downtown that's looking for help," she said, handing it to him. "They're willing to train someone who's a little out of practice. I thought of you as soon as I saw this." George hesitated, staring at the flyer. "What if I mess it up?" he asked quietly. "What if I can't do it anymore?" Helen placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've got more strength than you realize, George. And you've got Mittens. She believes in you. Maybe it's time you start believing in yourself, too." The next morning, George put on the best clothes he had, a button-up shirt and slacks donated by the shelter, and made his way to the woodworking shop. Mittens stayed behind, watching him go with an expression that seemed to say, "You've got this." The shop, called Crafted Futures, was small and smelled of sawdust and varnish. The owner, a middle-aged man named Tom, greeted George with a firm handshake and a warm smile. "Helen told me about you," Tom said. "She speaks highly of you and of your cat." George chuckled nervously. "Mittens has a way of winning people over." Tom led him to the back of the shop, where rows of tools and partially finished furniture lined the walls. "We're not fancy, but we take pride in our work," he said. "Why don't you show me what you can do?" George's hands trembled as he picked up a piece of sandpaper and began smoothing the edge of a wooden chair leg. The movements felt foreign at first, his fingers stiff and uncertain. But as he worked, something shifted. Muscle memory kicked in, and for the first time in years, George felt a flicker of the confidence he once had. By the time he finished, Tom was nodding appreciatively. "You've got talent," Tom said. "It's a little rough, but that's to be expected. If you're willing to put in the effort, I'd be happy to have you on board." George blinked, hardly daring to believe his ears. "Really? Really?" Tom said with a grin. "Welcome to the team." That evening, George returned to the shelter with a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. Mittens greeted him at the door, winding herself around his legs and purring loudly. "We did it," he said, scooping her up and holding her close. "We're finally turning things around. Over the next few weeks, George threw himself into his work. Each piece of furniture he crafted felt like a step toward reclaiming the life he had lost. Tom became both a mentor and a friend, offering guidance and encouragement every step of the way. And Mittens remained his constant companion, her presence reminding him of how far he had come and how far he could still go. As George's confidence grew, so did his determination to give back. He began volunteering at the shelter on weekends, helping others who were struggling as he once had. Mittens became something of a mascot for the shelter, her story of resilience and loyalty inspiring everyone who met her. Winter melted into spring, and with it came a sense of renewal. George had settled into his job at Crafted Futures, where his skills as a carpenter grew sharper each day. Tom, who had quickly become more like family than just a boss, even began giving George more complex projects, trusting him to design and build pieces from scratch. For the first time in years, George felt a sense of purpose, a reason to get up each morning that extended beyond just surviving. And, as always, Mittens was there, her quiet strength reminding him of the road they had walked together. The shelter, too, had become something of a second home. George still lived there while saving up for his own place, but more than that, he found himself drawn to helping others who were in the same position he had once been in. He shared his story in group meetings, helped newcomers navigate the resources available to them, and even offered to teach a woodworking workshop at the shelter's community center. Mittens, of course, became the star of the shelter. She had a way of sensing who needed her most, whether it was a lonely child clinging to their parent, or a man quietly battling the same demons George had once faced. People would often come to the shelter just to see her, and her story began to spread, first through word of mouth, then through a local news article written by a journalist who had been touched by her bond with George. The article, titled "The Cat Who Saved a Man," and how he saved her right back, painted a vivid picture of their journey. It spoke of George's struggle on the streets, the night Mittens had stood up to protect him, and how their bond had set them on a path of healing and hope. The story was shared widely, and soon, George found himself receiving messages of support from strangers across the city. Some even stopped by the shelter to drop off supplies, cat food, or donations, moved by the idea that even in the harshest circumstances, love could thrive. But the biggest change came one bright May morning, when Helen appeared at the shelter carrying a thick envelope. George had been sanding a small wooden box for one of his workshop projects when she approached him, her face lit with excitement. "George," she said, handing him the envelope, "I think you're going to want to open this." Curious, George wiped his hands on his jeans and carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from a housing organization, along with a set of keys. His heart began to race as he read the words, "Congratulations on your new home." Helen laughed softly at the stunned expression on his face. "We've been working on this for a while," she said. "Between your job, your dedication to the program, and the donations we've received since the article came out, we were able to secure you an apartment. It's small, but it's yours." George stared at her, the words struggling to form in his throat. I don't know what to say," he finally managed. "Say you'll go see it," Helen replied with a smile. "Mittens is going to need her own windowsill to sunbathe on."